Good afternoon, everyone. I hope by now you know that my name is Mark Maloney. I'm the Executive Director and Acting Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs. And once again, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here to the Chapsal Amphitheater for PSIA's Wednesday event. I know also, too, there are a great many people who are joining us online for what has proven to be a very popular event. And we did try to see if the larger amphitheater below us, Boutimi, was available, but unfortunately it wasn't today. So we're working in this space, but knowing that many of your colleagues, as well as some of our guests, are joining us online via Zoom. So welcome warmly to all of those who are joining us virtually, as well as those who are here with us in the amphitheater. Today's discussion is obviously a very timely one. No doubt all of you have followed in the course of the past months the developments in Afghanistan. And we're absolutely delighted that today we have a chance to have people who were very much involved both on the ground in Afghanistan, but also from in France and in the US to help those who were able to leave the country who needed to for various reasons, and indeed continue to work in that capacity. So no doubt there's much that we will all learn from our distinguished guests today. Let me thank them. I stand to the side so you can see them and I don't block them. First of all, there's Dr. Farida Momand, who is a former member of the Afghanistan High Council for National Reconciliation, as well as the former Minister of Higher Education. We're delighted to welcome you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
We also have with us here in the theater Fahima Robiol, who's a lecturer at ESSEC University here in Paris, but also at the universities of Kabul and Tehran. Dr. Robiol. And joining us on screen is Jim Townsend, who you may not know yet, but he is a lecturer with us at PSIA and will be teaching a course next semester. He's also the former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO policy. So someone very well placed to tell us all, again, more about the situation as it's developed. Really thank to each of you for being with us today to share your insights with our students. Stefan de Mistura, who was also on the agenda to speak today, unfortunately was due to a last-minute constraint is unable to join us. So he sends his greetings, but also to his regrets for not being able to join us at this time. But no doubt you'll get a chance to hear from Stefan de Mistura later on during the course of this academic year. He also teaches courses here with us at PSIA. So as I said, this event really is an opportunity also to mention the fact that Sciences Po itself has for some time worked to support Afghanistan and Afghanistan refugees. 5 years ago, Sciences Po opened a program for refugees, and many of the students on that program have come from Afghanistan. It's called Welcome Refugees. I'm delighted that Myriam Dubois-Moncachi, who is the acting vice president for studies at Sciences Po, who helped create that program, is here with us today. And please give her a warm round of applause for everything she's done. And just to say, in these last months, as we saw the situation which developed, Sciences Po very much did try to help our alumni, our students, and indeed their families to try to get to safety from them. And Miriam, but also to colleagues in the Department for International Affairs, including the head of that, Vanessa Scherer, and Kate Vivian, were both very much involved in that process. So, I mean, Sciences Po has done a lot to help, continues to do a lot to help, and all the more reason why today's event is so important. It's not just a hot topic, it's something which we fundamentally believe in and have been investing in for some time. So maybe I'll end my comments there with that, to wish you all a very enjoyable and enlightening event, and to hand over to Dr. Tina Robiol, who some of you will know is an academic advisor for our Masters in Human Rights and Humanitarian Action. She also will teach a course here at PSIA, and I now hand the floor to Tina to chair this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark, and welcome everyone here, everyone online. It's a real privilege to moderate this panel discussion today and have the opportunity to welcome our guests to Sciences Po, our guests here, and of course Jim, who is calling from DC. It's a privilege and also quite emotional, and I think that you will hear from them about what happened this past few weeks and their experience being evacuated from Kabul. So that's also another reason why I'm particularly grateful to have the chance to see them today. So sitting next to Dr. Momand is Zainab Salim, who has kindly accepted to help with the translation of Dr. Momand's answers to the Q&A part. And she is a graduate of the American University of Afghanistan and has worked for several NGOs, the UN, but also the European Union in Kabul. So she's also quite well versed in the topics that we're going to talk about today. So thank you so much, Zainab, for doing this. So thank you. So before I give the floor to our guests, I would like to offer just a brief overview of how our event is going to be organized. We will have first preliminary remarks from our guests, and then a short panel discussion, and then we'll open up for the Q&A part of our event. And this Q&A will be open to you, but also to our audience who is joining us through Zoom. This is indeed, as Mark said, a timely event. Last week, the International Peace Day launched the 76th session of the UN General Assembly. And of course, Afghanistan and the situation over there was high on the agenda, as you may have followed. So we were particularly eager at PSIA to organize this event at this point and have a discussion that would help us shed some light on the likely root causes of the current situation over there, but also try to see what are the impacts and the implications that those recent events may have for the near future. So the idea of this event is not necessarily to do, of course, an extensive analysis of the past 20 years, but to focus maybe on the negotiation process and the recent events that resulted in the takeover of the country by the Taliban last month. So the first person that I'm going to give the floor to is Fahimeh Robiol, and I have the pleasure to give her the floor because she has extensive experience in Afghanistan. She has worked with several groups of Afghan women leaders this past 10 years at the national, but also at the local level over there with different partners and an organization including UNDP. And the goal of the capacity building programs that she facilitated was to help Afghan women reinforce their leadership skills and negotiation skills in particular. Several members of the latest delegation that she has worked with did actually participate in the negotiation talks with the Taliban in 2019 in Doha. And so considering her expertise, we have asked her to start this panel by giving an overview of this negotiation process with the Taliban, its key steps, issues, challenges, because we think that this overview will be essential for the next steps of this conversation. So Fahimeh, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tina. Thank you very much for inviting me. I am very honored to take part in this panel. In order to analyze the American negotiation with the Taliban, followed by the negotiation between the delegations of the government of Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, I would like to establish the chronology of negotiations, the key challenges until August 2021, when Kabul fell. The start of the negotiation process with the Taliban dates back to 2012, when in a discreet way, the Taliban established in Doha a representative office. The most important event this year was the third Chantilly meeting in France between Karzai's government, the Taliban, the Northern Alliance, and Hizb Islami. We hear that 2 women among the participants. In 2016, the government signed a peace deal with the Hizb Islami of Hekmatyar to cease hostilities, cut ties to extremist group, and respect the Afghan constitution. Starting in 2018, the peace process intensified with the start of bilateral talks between the Taliban and the United States in Doha. Major powers such as China, India, Pakistan, Russia, NATO played the role of facilitators in this peace. This process was conducted without no representation of the Afghan government. Even in 2019, meetings were organized in Moscow between the Afghan opposition that include former President Hamid Karzai and the Taliban without the government. And intra-Afghan meetings were organized in July 2019 between a delegation of about 20 Taliban and 60 Afghan who were not representatives of the Afghan state, as required by the Taliban. They exchanged views about the Islamic Emirates, Sharia versus Republic Constitution, the achievement of the last 20 years, including women's rights and how to stop violence. The United States signed an agreement for bringing peace to Afghanistan with the Taliban on 29th of February 2020, and a comprehensive peace agreement made in 4 parts. Guarantees and enforcement mechanisms that will prevent the use of the soil of Afghanistan by any group against the security of the United States and its allies. Guarantees enforcement mechanism and announcement of the timeline for the withdrawal of all foreign forces from Afghanistan within 14 months. After announcement of guarantees for a complete withdrawal, the Taliban would start intra-Afghan negotiations with Afghan side on March 10, 2020. The participants in intra-Afghan negotiations would discuss the date and modalities of the permanent and comprehensive ceasefire, including the implementation mechanisms, with an agreement over the future political roadmap of Afghanistan. These 4 parts are interrelated and interdependent. The agreement also included the following provisions as confidence-building measures with the coordination and approval of all relevant sides. Up to 5,000 prisoners of Taliban and up to 1,000 prisoners of the other side would be released by March 10, 2020. The Taliban had to commit that their prisoners would not pose a threat to the security of US and its allies. With the start of intra-Afghan negotiations, the United States will initiate an administrative review of current US sanctions and the rewards list against a member of Taliban, with the goal of removing these sanctions by August 2020. On March 10, 2020, the UN Security Council voted unanimously in favor of a resolution to support the US-Taliban peace agreement. With this vote, the members of the Security Council committed themselves to agreement, turning this bilateral pact to a multinational one by default. The way that international community, and especially the American, have treated the Taliban has propelled them from a terrorist group with severe sanctions to a responsible delegation received in major capital cities as a delegation of a state. In the absence of any clause of verification of the United States-Taliban agreement, many of the 5,000 prisoners joined forces against the Afghan civilian and Afghan forces. Taliban's violence largely intensified in different regions, and particularly with the targeted assassinations of activists, journalists, judges, historians, philosophers. President Ghani appointed a 21-member delegation, including 4 women representing the Afghan people, to start the inter-Afghan negotiations, which started in 12 September 22, aiming to end decades of war through a political settlement that would be unprecedented in the country's recent history. There was a huge gap between the Taliban's vision of an Islamic state and the government's commitment to the constitution that guarantees democracy and women's rights. In November 2020, after 2 months' discussions, the 2 negotiations team agreed only on a code of conduct and non-agenda. Moscow hosted in March 2021 and Qatar in April other meetings called Troika, and the extended Troika, Russian, Chinese, the United States, Pakistan, Afghan government, Afghan political figures, and the Taliban, as well as Qatar. In most of them, either 1 or 2 women maximum were invited. This meeting focused on making progress in anti-Afghan process to reach a negotiated settlement and permanent and comprehensive ceasefire, precising that there were no military solution and it was not acceptable to come to power with force. In Doha, United States and NATO announced that US NATO forces would begin a responsible withdrawal from Afghanistan. As in the UN Security Council Resolution 2513 and the Moscow Resolution, it was stated, we do not support the restoration of the Islamic Emirate. As the Taliban gained ground in the regions, they refused all requests of the Afghan government delegation and the international community to reduce violence and accept a ceasefire. The Afghan army didn't fully determine the strategy, either follow the population's desire for peace or retaliate against the Taliban attacks. While the Taliban traveled from one country's capital to another and they were welcomed with respect, the Afghan state delegation waited for them without any agenda in Doha, and on the ground the violence was increased, making more and more victims, including through target killings. The last conference planned by the US was supposed to take place in May 21 in Istanbul, where the power-sharing roadmap drawn by Zalmay Khalilzad, the US representative, was to discuss and approved as a peace plan. The Taliban refused to attend and refused the power sharing. They were gaining the ground. The last months, several times, the Afghan delegation requested the presence of a mediator and more active role of United Nations in the negotiation, but it was too late. As conclusion, the negotiation process of US Taliban, as well as the UN Security Council resolution to support the US Taliban peace agreement, have over-legitimated the Taliban and delegitimized the Afghan government and its delegation at Doha. The Taliban had no intention to negotiate. They bought time to gain ground with the support of region actors. They knew that the US withdrawal was effective no matter what happened on the ground. The Taliban signed an agreement with the US behind the back of the Afghan people and without any obligation verifiable by the international community. The peace process in Afghanistan has left 35 million Afghans to be governed by less than 100,000 fighters who came to power by force. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Fahimeh, and thanks to this quick overview, we can see already how this process, at least between when there were negotiations between the US government and the Taliban, how this process has fragilized indeed the Afghan government. So with no transition, I'm giving the floor to Jim Townsend, who will easily follow up on this part of the conversation with his perspective from the US and on the US foreign and security policy. We asked him to join his panel, and are very grateful that he accepted because of his, of course, his experience at the Department of Defense, but also with NATO, at the Pentagon. He will tell you more about that, and of course his work currently at the Center for a New American Security. So we know that he has an interesting insight about this current situation, but also this past process, and I've asked him to actually comment on the disintegration also of the Afghan army, despite all the resources and training invested by the US and the international community. And more generally, Jim is going to offer comments also on the impact of the crisis on the US government. As you have heard, President Biden has fallen in the polls in this past few weeks after what happened in Kabul. So Jim, over to you. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone, and good afternoon, actually, from Washington, D.C. I want to say, first of all, to Tina, thank you, and to the Dean, to Mark, for putting on this very important panel discussion. And I really appreciate all the students coming as well, because a lot of what we will talk about today will be things that will face you as students as you get into your careers, whatever it may be. A lot of what I'll be talking about certainly are lessons learned, painful lessons learned from the United States, and I think the beneficiaries of this discussion today will be you, and I hope what we say can be helpful. To my colleague who just spoke, what you laid out and what you described to everyone, that is in keeping with what I understand as well. And it is heartbreaking to me, and it is a very emotional panel and a very emotional discussion that we will have today. And I will say that the past month experience, not just of the fall of Kabul, but also the 20th anniversary of 9/11, really impacted so hard those of us in the United States that were working, not just were there at 9/11 and trying to deal with that tragedy, but also so many Americans who were working in Afghanistan in so many dimensions. It was a very emotional time, and we all called each other, we talked to each other, we were with each other on social media to try to get through this period of the fall of Kabul, as well as the 9/11 anniversary. And so for us, this was a very emotional time and one that we must learn from. I thought what I would do while I have the floor is to talk a little bit about this whole experience from a Washington perspective, from the perspective that I saw when I was at the Pentagon and when I was at NATO, from the very earliest days after 9/11 and as we began to work with Afghanistan. And I want to just touch on these to help explain what the mindset might have been as we dealt with these final months or final couple of years, dealing with the Taliban, dealing with the US and allied presence in Afghanistan, some of that mindset. And I think the first point I would want to make is that when 9/11 happened, it set off in the US something that I'd never seen in my lifetime, which was this great anger at being surprised and great fear that we were surprised and great fear that there was another great plot that could happen in the United States. It set off in the US government, but it also set off among the American people and in Congress this great paranoia and this fear that something was going to happen suddenly. And that once again, we'd be surprised. And it set off a spasm response that as we look back 20 years at what was happening in Washington on 9/11 and shortly thereafter, it looks just, it looks irrational. And a lot of it was, but it was fed by the fears of the time. We created laws such as the Patriot Act and other things that in fact had an impact on US civil liberties. It started the global war on terrorism, which was made up of a number of different, both military and political actions by the United States and by some of our allies, but particularly it set off the invasion of Iraq, which was a tremendous mistake that we all know. And I think so many knew at the time that this was probably not what we should be doing in those months and years that followed after 9/11. But it happened. And it was fed by a ideology at the time in the George W. Bush administration. It was fed by this fear, but it was fed by this ideology of the global war on terrorism, which set the United States off on a path that other presidents had to inherit and to deal with. But two things happened. One other thing happened out of 9/11 besides this global war on terrorism, and that was when we went into Afghanistan and we toppled the Taliban and we began to look for bin Laden. Something that Bob Gates used to tell us at the Pentagon, this is in 2009, 2010, what he told us in the Pentagon was that we cannot abandon Afghanistan once the Taliban is gone. He felt very strongly that after the Soviet Union left Afghanistan, that the United States, in fact, and the international community had abandoned Afghanistan with a power vacuum that was filled by the Taliban. And that was something that was frankly to him unacceptable. And he even felt guilty because he was part of the George H.W. Bush administration. He felt guilty that had happened. And he said, now, here we are in 2009, 2010, we cannot do that again to Afghanistan. And so he, as well as the Obama administration, for 8 years within the Obama administration, began to try to help buy time, he would say. We need to buy time for the Afghan people to try to put together a nation that they want to see, a nation that would respect the roles of women, a nation that could try to recover from the past of the Taliban. So we began to embark upon that. But what happened was that effort ran into what was happening in Iraq. And I think what I saw, certainly, and as I described to you, these are things that I saw. So much of the George W. Bush administration and then what was inherited by Obama was this focus on Iraq, as Iraq began to get worse and worse and worse. And I think we took our eyes off the ball, as we say in the US. We took our eyes off of our goals in Afghanistan, and we focused instead on Iraq and on this global war on terrorism. So in the Obama administration, where I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, in that first 4 years, we began to try to figure out what should the US presence look like. And I think this is where the seeds were planted that we saw later when Joe Biden became president. We saw in those early days of the Obama administration trying to figure out what that US presence looked like and what should the US military be doing there. There was a feeling, certainly among Joe Biden and some of his people when he was the vice president, that our presence needed to be smaller. It needed to be focused on counterterrorism. And instead, we needed to focus more on helping Afghanistan create the stability that we know that was important for Afghanistan to have in order to build the nation that we felt that was desired. And so as the debate within the Obama administration became very heated between the vice president and the president, and there was a feeling, I think, among Vice President Biden and his people that the U.S. military was still intent on surging forces in and having a heavy military footprint. And that's what won at the end of the day. President Obama decided to have the surge, as you know. And to focus on trying to provide better security and focus on more training and equipping of the Afghan military. And that's what took up a lot of the time in the Obama administration. But I think what has become apparent was that during those 8 years, as we began to rebuild and to strengthen the Afghan military, we were putting a burden on them as well. A burden that the structure that they would have as a military force relied on the United States to be there, relied on US assistance, both financial as well as in the terms of maintenance and in terms of contractors to come in and maintain what became a new Afghan Air Force and new Afghan Special Forces. And so much of what was being created in those 8 years of Obama began to look like a US style military force that would require a US logistics structure. And so slowly this began to happen. I visited Afghanistan twice. I talked with the US military leadership there and with Afghan military leadership there. They were very optimistic about the future, very optimistic about the progress of the Afghan forces, as they should have been, because the Afghan soldiers and the Afghan military forces and their chain of command were doing a very good job. And I think over the past few months, unfairly, they have been criticized. But I will say that from what I saw and from what a lot of our leadership saw, they were doing a good job. But there were problems too. There was problems with corruption. There was problems with towards the end, as you know, with a weakening of the will to fight as these negotiations with the Taliban began to take place, as my colleague laid out before me. As the word became spread among the Afghan defense forces and the police forces that there was going to be a deal cut with the Taliban, and as they began to take advantage of that as well, to spread fear among the Afghan forces that they were coming back and that deals must be cut to avoid imprisonment or worse. That began to sap the will to fight by the Afghan forces as well. So what we began to see was that the strategy that the United States and that our allies began to embark on in terms of equipping and training the Afghan forces, in terms of helping to build the Afghan state, whether it was with Hamid Karzai or whether it was with successive governmental forces, Ashraf Ghani and others in Kabul. We were helping to build a state, but we weren't nurturing a nation. And that was what Secretary of Defense Austin said yesterday in the Congress. And I think we all saw that too. And what concerns me so much as I look back on those days was that a lot of the lessons that we should have taken from working with South Vietnam, where we were trying to do some very similar things with the South Vietnamese people and South Vietnamese governments, that we had some of the same problems in terms of the U.S. strategy, our approach. And it worries me about that, because we must take from our experience in Afghanistan, we must take some lessons on how we approach situations like this, which will surely come in the future. And so I think that we were setting expectations in Afghanistan that we were never going to be able to achieve. I think we didn't have the strategic patience to stay in there for the fight, strategic patience to keep forces there until we could overcome some of the obstacles that we were seeing in these last couple of years. And so just to wrap up, Tina, because I know we need to go on to questions, but I think what we began to see is that Afghanistan, and Iraq too, U.S. involvement, allied involvement in both of those situations, that became part of our U.S. politics in the last couple of years. It was called the Forever Wars. If you've heard that term, I'm sure you have. The Forever Wars began to be a political agenda point for Democrats and Republicans. And the Trump administration particularly began to look on getting out of Afghanistan and Iraq as something that would be helpful to him in terms of his presidential reelection campaign. And so he began to push very hard for this agreement that my colleague just laid out, an agreement that was flawed, and an agreement that was something that gave great heart to the Taliban and sapped the will of the Afghan fighting forces to fight against a Taliban that felt victory would be theirs eventually. And so we saw the product of that flawed approach by Donald Trump in order to have a point to make in the November elections for president, where he could say, "I got us out of Afghanistan." But the price that he was going to have to be paid was one that fell to Biden to have to pay. And we can talk about that in the next few minutes. But that's what Biden that's what he inherited. He inherited this situation that was put together by the Trump administration. But not to be political about this, the roots of what we were having to deal with and that Trump was trying to avoid by putting together this peace approach, the roots go back to the US strategy in Afghanistan. It goes back to flaws in how we went about training the Afghan forces. It's certainly roots that go back also to corruption and to political problems in Kabul, which we can talk about too, but we shouldn't necessarily overplay. But I think as we look at the future, and this is the last point, Tina, as we look at the future, the impact on the United States, these situations will come and be placed on our plate again in the future. Like Vietnam was for us, that wasn't the only time we were going to have a situation like we saw in South Vietnam in the 1960s and early 1970s, because we have seen this now in Afghanistan and Iraq, and we will see it again. We have to do a better job as a nation, the United States, both politically and well as militarily. We have to do a better job of learning about ourselves as a nation, ourselves as a political body in terms of the patience that we have or do not have when it comes to these kinds of international events that we find ourselves in, that we have to have a better understanding that we too quickly jump into something without understanding where we're jumping. The complex society that is Afghanistan, the complex foe that is the Taliban, and our own limitations. We have to have a better understanding of that as the United States, because we will find ourselves in this situation again. And we must do a better job than we have done over the past 20 years as we deal with what has become the heartbreak of Afghanistan. The last thing I'll say, Tina, and I know I've said this before, but the last thing here is Afghanistan is still, for the United States, very close to our hearts. We're not finished with Afghanistan. The Biden administration cannot now walk away and say we have a strategic failure, as the Secretary of Defense said, and therefore we're walking away. We cannot. So we're going to have to look into the next number of months as we deal with the Taliban and we deal with the lingering problems for the United States within Afghanistan, but to try to salvage and save and build as best we can those institutions and those relationships that we did succeed in building over the past 20 years when it comes to Afghan society. I'm not sure how you do that when we're not there to help, but we must find a way. So we cannot walk away from Afghanistan, even given what has happened over the past couple of months. It's not over for us or for the international community, but we have to try to bend the curve of history here and see what we can do to try to bring some salvage to the people of Afghanistan. We owe it to them.
Jim.
And we can't falter from that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jim. Thank you, and I'm glad that you underlined the fact that we can't really disconnect what happened in Afghanistan and the decisions of the U.S. government with their intervention in Iraq. That's completely true, and that you also brought up the importance of corruption in what happened with the Afghan army and its dependence and the model that was brought. So, as you said, we have to do a better job. in the US. But I think I would add that we have to do a better job as the international community and learn also from those lessons much more. Okay, so thank you so much. And now it's my privilege to give the floor to Dr. Moment, that I would like to thank really warmly for accepting our invitation to speak today. As a Minister for Higher Education, Dr. Moment was particularly influential in improving access and quality of education for women and girls in Afghanistan. And of course, I'm biased, but I'm really grateful for that. In many of her positions, she has demonstrated her commitment to human rights and women's rights in particular. So Dr. Moment has accepted to offer her perspective from the ground, and especially as a former member of the High Council for National Reconciliation, the organ that Fahime was talking about, that was created 2 years ago. And she will start by providing some insights from inside on the negotiation talks, and then reflect on the takeover of the Taliban and what she believes this means for the country. And finally, if we have time, I have asked her to try to answer a question that many of us have heard this past few weeks, which is, was it worth it? And was this international intervention of those past 20 years worth it? So thank you so much, Madam Minister, and welcome. We're looking forward to hearing you.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you, Mark. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and our friends that are online. It's a pleasure for me to be here amongst you to share my thoughts and views and feelings about today's tragedy of Afghanistan. After the fall of the cruel and backwarded regime of Taliban through NATO forces with the leadership of US, Afghanistan had gotten a second chance of rebuilding from war and misfortune. The opportunity that could have been better used with better management of and solid intention to bring sustainable change and fight against international terrorism. Today, the world would have not been witness of the shameful fall of Afghanistan to terrorist group called Taliban. National High Peace Council and the reasons for failure. National High Peace Council was established in February 2020 based on the political agreement between former President Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah Abdullah after the fraudulent elections to keep Abdullah Abdullah satisfied with having a role in the formation of government. Abdullah Abdullah was appointed as chairman who shall lead the peace process. In order to build political consensus, the members of the council were the political leaders and national personalities. National High Peace Council consisted of 50 members, out of which 10 of them were women. It had 9 deputies, of whose only 1 person was a woman. The council's members were all political people, and some of the members were elders of different ethnicities and known people publicly. The budget of this council was managed by the administrative office of the president, which questioned the independence of the council. Therefore, 2 main reasons for failure of the council was financial dependence of the government and having different members with different political views and interests closed the doors toward having one decision maker and one viewpoint on the peace process. The competition between Ghani and Abdullah's competitors and members of the council paved the way for failure of the High Peace Council. The work of the council was more of a reactionary than proactive approach towards national interest and peace process. The fact that role of women in the council and decision-making meetings was very low also is important to consider for the failure of the council. All the reasons mentioned caused the failure of National High Peace Council and did not open ways for a durable solution towards peace and national solidarity. Taliban's government. The UN has recognized Taliban as an international terrorist group having deep ideological relations and connections with Al-Qaeda. But they are back into power after 20 years in Afghanistan. They had not changed and are the same 20 years old Taliban with zero respect to human rights, their own interpretation of Islamic values, which turns to a cruel yet self-proclaimed owners of the country that they have shed bloods of thousands of people during last 20 years. Their arrival into power have caused the collapse of the government and our national army. And during their own 1 month, so-called or self-proclaimed government, they have already undermined women and girls of their basic rights to education and work. Girls' schools are closed, girls are not allowed to attend universities, and Ministry of Women Affairs is already demolished. The Masters of Women and Gender Studies in Kabul University is demolished, and Taliban have announced their cabinet with 0 women representative in the cabinet. There is no plan or discussion on social, political, and economic activities in the country. The constitution, which is the highest level order of the country and stipulates rights of the women, minorities, and all ethnic groups, is suspended. Those who advocated for Taliban, saying that Taliban have changed and they are not the Taliban they used to be 20 years back and were indirectly lobbying for Taliban, shall be questioned. Now is the time for world to not recognize Taliban as a government, as the fall of Afghanistan into Taliban would be a responsibility on the world powers for the following reasons. First, empowerment of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. As there is no presence of NATO and US forces in Afghanistan, National Army is not present too, and the Taliban recruiting young boys from different ethnic and religious groups that will strengthen roots of ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Based on a UN data, it is estimated that currently there are 2,000 ISIS troops fighting inside Afghanistan, and around 200 up to 500 members of Al-Qaeda are present in Afghanistan. Second, forced migrations. For decades, Afghans are migrating and leaving their country due to security reasons, and Taliban coming into power would increase these migration into not only neighboring countries, but also Western countries. The fall of Islamic Republic of Afghanistan have vastly amounted to increased migration from the country, not only for security reasons, but also those who tasted democracy and liberty during past 19 years will not be able to live life under Taliban again. Third, narcotics. Taliban, both during their government and during their past 20 years, are prone to cultivation of poppy and drug trafficking to other countries. This is a big revenue for Taliban, estimated 20 to 40% of their income is from poppy, based on some numbers during 2018 in areas under the Taliban control. Taliban had gained $600 million from poppy cultivation and drug trafficking. Taliban into power again in Afghanistan would mean US and NATO's failure fighting narcotics and poverty in Afghanistan. The increase of poverty due to lack of economic activities in country would pave the way for people to go back to poppy cultivation and drug trafficking for daily livelihood. Fourth, the extremist Islamic ideology will prevail not in Afghanistan, but also in regional countries like Pakistan, Tajikistan, and Iran, and this will increase risk towards security in India, China, Russia, and Europe as well. Before mentioning the achievement during these 20 years, I would like to say some words about the governance. Islamic Republic of Afghanistan was threatened with differences of ideologies, lack of infrastructure, lack of systems and public acceptance from the very beginning of its establishment in the year 1383. During the 18 years fight against Taliban, the political elite in Afghanistan were not able to provide a political vision for the people and collectively respond to the situation. They could not define national interests and were not able to bring every political party or movement together. Terms such as democracy and republic were not based on its meaning, but they were just used to trick public by the political face and their international allies. This has caused more harm to the newborn democracy in Afghanistan. The country was facing with lack of constitutionalism to observe the usage of resources through high government officials and the president. The three vital components of democracy, which are people government, rule of law, and differentiation of the three powers, and observation by people, was not present. Illegal regulation and laws passed by the president, interference in the parliament and judiciary, focused power inside presidential palace and administrative office of the president that was beyond laws and governance, interference of the staff of AOP in the mandates of ministries, all proves that illegal and dictatorship of the government. With all the problems related to the lack of the governance, we shall not forget the achievements of the 2 decades. The elected government now, either with or without corruption, is an achievement. The difference between legal, executive, and judicial branches and division of power between them was an achievement. Existence of a unified constitution stipulating human rights, rights of women and minority religious and ethnic groups was an achievement. Schools for girls and women having social and political rights was an achievement. Women holding higher and decision-making position in the government was also an achievement. Free media and press was an achievement with which had turned to an advisor to government, seeking public opinion and making the government hear public, establishing of connected routes to regional countries for economic activities, water dams, building infrastructures and zonal provinces, establishment of Women Affairs Ministry, positive discrimination against women during recruitments, e-governance, schools in faraway villages, and establishing of army and police force are all of the achievements we cannot underestimate and forget. For me, who have worked 20 years of my life to contribute towards building a better and peaceful Afghanistan, witnessing all my dreams to come to an end and fell into dust, these are the hardest times of my life to be alive. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. Thank you.
It's not easy. Can you hear me? Yeah. It's not easy to follow up on this. Thank you so much, Madam Minister, for speaking so openly about the situation in Afghanistan and the lessons or conclusion you've taken, but also of your personal challenges these days. The alarming reports of human rights violations, the decisions that the Taliban have already taken These past few weeks are of concern for sure, and you're right. I think that the strategic question of whether they're going to be an international recognition of the Taliban is important. So we are going to move to the Q&A part of this event, and I would have a lot of questions for all of you, but I'm sure you will have the same ones. So let's do that. So a few guidelines for this part. There are 2 microphones on each side of the room. I see one student already lining up over there. So if you have questions, don't hesitate to get up and make lines on those microphones, the ones that are closest to you. And please start with indicating your name, your program, and make sure you specify who you're addressing the question to in our panel, and please stick to one short question so we can take many questions. And so for our guests, I would ask you, first of all, thank you for answering the questions of our students, and please try to have short answers as much as possible so we can address more questions. Okay, and same thing, of course, questions are open for our audience on Zoom, so don't hesitate, and I see we already also have a question there. So we can start with you.
Yeah. Is it on?
Yes.
Thank you very much. خوش آمدید با فرانسه. My name is Shamima, and I'm from Tajikistan, and so I'm really happy to see you here, and thank you so much for touching this topic and sharing your stories. And I would say that I have, family and friends in Afghanistan because I'm from the Badakhshan part of Tajikistan, and there is Badakhshan in Afghanistan as well. So my question would be regarding Ahmad Massoud. Do you, in the side of Afghanistan, consider him like his son, like Ahmad Shah Massoud's son, Ahmad Massoud, as a hero, really? And do you really believe that there is still a hope for change, because we do know that Panjshir is still a place where Ahmad Massoud is calling people, to come and to join and to still fight against the Talibs. And do you think that there is a hope for that? Because back home, I have been also working with Aga Khan Foundation, and we have our offices back in Afghanistan as well. And we're still planning of working there, and helping the people. And we're still working on humanitarian, supporting the Afghan people with some humanitarian help. And the other thing that I would like also to mention is, yes, it's a question, it's just a comment. You have mentioned that it is a shameful fail of Afghanistan and Afghan people, but I would personally say that it is a shameful fail of the world, not Afghanistan, because let's remember the day when there was Independence Day of Afghanistan, right? And there were brave women and men and boys and girls of Afghanistan who came out to the streets with their flag, despite the fact that they were surrounded by Talibs all around the city, but they still were going and and kind of talking about their love toward the motherland. So I would still consider this as the fail of the world, not the fail of Afghans. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
امیدواری شده که هغه برای عمومی بدن
انگلیسی جواب بدید.
به فارسی ما جواب میدید که باشه خانم چی بخاطر اینکه
به انگلیسی میخواد
به فارسی
به فارسی باشه.
من یک بار جواب بگیرم باز ترجمه کنم.
اینطور است که احمد شاه مسعود پسر قهرمان ملی افغانستان است و قهرمان ملی خودش از حیثیت و اعتبار زیاده در بین افغان‌ها برخوردار است، مخصوصا در دوره مقاومتی که علیه طالبان انجام داده بود توانست که اما شخصیت ملی بودن خود را دوباره احیا کنه. آرزوی ما است که احمد مسعود هم چون پسر قهرمان ملی است برای او ادامه بده و بیشتر بتونه که جوانای افغانستان را با افکار ملی در دور خود جمع کنه، چرا که متاسفانه کشور ما بعضا مسائل تنظیمی و گپاهاد است و هرگاه یک جوان به یک طرف سوق بتن او از افکار ملیش باز میمونه. ما آرزوی ما است که احمد مسعود من حیثیت جوان آگاه کشور بس به شکل ملی وارد مبارزه شود و جوانای تمام سراسر افغانستان بدون در نظر داشته ملیت و قوم و مذهب و وابستگی بتونه به دور خود جمع کنه تا مثل پدرش یک قهرمان شود و بتونه که مقاومت جدیدی را علیه طالبان شکل بده.
Okay, I will translate Ms. Moman's response. So she said that yes, we do know Ahmad Massoud, and he is one of our heroes. He would be considered a national hero like his father if he goes with the national interest and not with the interest of a single political party. If he aims to attract all the youth of all the ethnic groups and religious groups and minorities in Afghanistan under one flag and under one national interest, there is hope for him to gain that power again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So let's take one question from you and from you too, if you could be short, and we'll combine the answers.
Yeah, am I audible? I am, right? Okay. So this was regarding the Taliban propaganda, because, I mean, you are on social media, you can't be averse of the propaganda spewed by the Taliban with regards to what they want to do in Afghanistan. So how do you think the West or the rest of the world should counteract that? Because in regards to Taliban propaganda, there is also radicalization, and through radicalization there will be more people joining the Taliban, and soon it will amass a lot more people than it already has, even the common civilians. So how do you think can social media giants or even the West can counteract that? Because that's a very terrible problem. Even from South Asian countries, there are people leaving for Afghanistan and so on.
Sorry, who are you addressing your question to?
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Dr. Momand?
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, I'm so sorry.
د دې سوال دا دی چې سوشل میډیا باندې طالبان پروپاګاندا کوي په دې چې موږ ډېر خلک لرو او خلک موږ سره دي. تاسو څه فکر کوئ چې سوشل میډیا به په دې کې څنګه
مهمی است که خب امروز طالبان متاسفانه به یک قوت تبدیل شدن. سوشل میدیا در اختیارشان است و اینا قبل از او هم بدبختانه در سوشل میدیا فعال بودن و پروپاگانداها و یا اشتهاراتی که اینا برای خود میکنن و فکر میکنن که مردم افغانستان با اینها است، این کاملا فقط پروپاگانداست و اینا از بخش پروپاگاندها و از بخش سوشال میدیا متاسفانه فعال هستند. ولی مردم افغانستان هوشیارتر از آن هستند که فریب مسائل و حرفهای از اینا را بخورند، به خاطر از اینکه حرف تا عمل بسیار تفاوت است. اینا در عمل یک چیز هستند و در حرف کاملا چیز دیگه. از این خاطر اعمال از اینا نشان دهنده از این است که مردم افغانستان دیگه فریب فقط حرف را و فقط سوشال میدیا را نخواهند خورد.
یعنی که مردم مواجه شدن هم یکی از اینها هست.
بله، و یکی مهمترین گپی که مردم افغانستان به مهاجرت های دست جمعی دست یافتند، یک دلیل است که مردم افغانستان از اینا تنفر دارند، مخصوصا طبقه تحصیل یافته و جوان کشور، جوانای کشور که امروز آینده خود تاریک می‌بینند. اینا همگی در یک ناامیدی به سر میبرند و همگی آرزو دارند که به صورت دست جمعی از کشور خارج شوند. این خود نشان دهنده از است که افکار طالبان و اعمالشان قطعا مورد قبول مردم افغانستان نیست.
So Ms. Momand's response is that we do agree that the Taliban have vast access to social media today, and they know English, they speak English as well, some of them, albeit. But people of Afghanistan being with the Taliban is not true, and what they're saying on the social media is not true, because they just want to play with people's minds and reach more people through social media. The reasons she is mentioning that the Afghan people are not with the Taliban is the group migrations that has happened during last month in August. This is one of the prominent reasons that says that the people of Afghanistan are not with the Taliban, and they don't want to live under the Taliban's government. Especially the ones who are educated, they do not want to live under the Taliban, and they do not agree with the way the Taliban governs Afghanistan. Thank you.
So Fahmy wants to add something to this.
Before August, it was in each region that the Taliban were progressing, there were the groups of the people who left the regions with nothing. And all these people hoped to come to Kabul in order to be safe. When we asked them why you have left your home, they said, because we don't want that our small daughters be captured by the Taliban. They bring them by force and they disappeared because the Taliban in each region, they took by force, married by force the small children, girls of 9 or 10 years for them, and most of the time they left the place. It was showed clearly that the people are afraid from the Taliban and the people are not anymore from their side.
Thank you. I'm going to use one of the questions from the chat now. And so it's a question from Chin Yu from Taiwan, a student in the Master of International Governance and Diplomacy at PSIA. And it's a question for you, Jim. So she's asking if you think that the Biden administration is going to eventually recognize the Taliban government officially if they stay into power at least for a year or two from now.
Thank you. That's a very good question, and it's one that is being discussed in Washington and in a number of capitals as well as at the United Nations. This is, but I will say that it's, whether it's in Washington, but also by other decision makers in other capitals, there's an understanding that we've got to use our leverage over the Taliban as best we can to try to get compromises from them in terms of how they go about governance. My colleagues on the panel have laid out in a wonderful and very important way both the successes from the last 20 years in terms of building institutions or building awareness in terms of women and girls and education, the media, that type of thing in Afghanistan. If we are to try to keep the embers alive of that, we have to use our leverage, whether it's the recognition of the Taliban or assistance for Afghanistan. We have to be able to use this leverage to try to bring about as best we can change. And so I hope that in fact we do not recognize the Taliban anytime soon until we see by their actions that they are willing to make change, meaningful change in the way they govern Afghanistan. So to answer your question, my belief is the Biden administration feels that very strongly. And I don't see the Biden administration doing anything to help the Taliban as long as we see this backsliding by the Taliban to the ways they governed in the 1990s. And as they dismantle so much of the progress that we've seen over the past 20 years. And I think there's other governments are standing with us as well on that.
Thank you very much, Jim. If I could, add the question to that, but maybe it's going to come from you. It's you mentioned the flawed approach from Donald Trump when he did the negotiation with the Taliban under his administration. And so we can wonder, why did the Biden administration implemented this agreement in the first place? But that maybe will come up. Let me give you the floor, and maybe also the person is right behind you. So if we could group those two questions, thank you. And remember to say to whom you're asking the question first. Thank you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. My name is William Lighthart. I'm in the Master of Human Rights and Humanitarian Action at SIA, and my question is for Dr. Rubio or the Madam Minister. We heard today throughout the panel discussions that these are important lessons that we must carry to future similar occurrences, but how may we also use these lessons to continue to help the people of Afghanistan, I guess especially from the position of the international community, whether that's through empowerment of actors and advocates who have remained behind, or addressing some of the socioeconomic shortcomings that the US or other international actors should have invested in, which allowed the Taliban to maintain their necessity in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Hello, my question, my name My name is Ryan. I'm a master in politics and public policy. My question is for Mr. Townsend. So you mentioned lessons learned by the failures in Afghanistan and how this will be important to recognize with similar situations in the future. I was wondering if, as you can speak on both the US and NATO intervention, on what specific lessons we have learned regarding military intervention and the seemingly contradictory role in country stabilization.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so the first question is why so سوال اول که
From achievement point of view, I can say that I traveled to Afghanistan from 2009. Each year, I participated of each of the election as independent observer. I went from one poll station to the others, and I could see each year the development and the things which were occurred, at least in Kabul. The Kabul that I saw in 2009 was not at all as I saw in 2019. In the University of Kabul, I was teaching in the Master of Gender and Women's Studies, where there were 40 professors coming from different regions, and they were learning how to implement the notion of the gender in the country. So there was something extraordinary in this region, because I can say you that a Master of Gender and Women's Studies doesn't exist in this region. So we could imagine that there was a lot of development and bringing the people toward to live in the other manner. So I think that the Taliban has changed in worst. But I think that the people of Afghanistan are not the same that they were 20 years ago, particularly that 65% of the Afghan people are under 24. So they didn't see, they only heard about all these things. And now I think that it is early with this shock to say what will happen. Today, everybody wants to leave. Everybody wants to leave, and I said to Mark, my telephone number has distributed in the airport saying that this lady maybe will help us. So it is really very early for us to say what will happen to this population, which are really in a very, very great stress. And I think that for the international community, it's very early to make a decision to recognize these people, because the problem will not stay in Afghanistan. In Sahel, in Boko Haram, they will say, wow, we have changed the nature of the world. Now the terrorism can be in the good stage as the other class of the world. So saying that we want to see how the Taliban would work, they cannot work the other manner, as they know. Imagine that the director of the central bank of Afghanistan didn't finish his primary school. So how we can imagine that these people will change, how we can imagine that these people will govern? Okay, so these questions in my mind is very, very preliminary and so much quick Because when we make a mistake, I'm sorry to say that, I'm sorry to be long, when we make a mistake, we try to correct it so rapidly that we make another mistake, where we are in Afghanistan.
Thank you. Let's move to Jim with the second question. And Jim, please, can you keep it a bit short? Because we have 4 more students lining up for questions. Thank you.
Yes, I will keep it short. It's an excellent question, and I'm going to go rapidly through it. The first is, whether it was South Vietnam or Afghanistan or Iraq, we can't tell when and how and what the characteristics will be of the next situation like this. So it's very hard. You can certainly learn lessons, but a lot of times those lessons aren't applicable to the surprise that is right over the horizon. So I think the first thing I would say is that lessons learned only go so far, and we have to be ready for surprise. If there's anything that we've got to take on board our experiences, we have got to know that this is going to be a surprise and it will be different than what came before. The second thing I would say is that we have a tendency in the United States to over-rely on the military as the first responders to go into a unstable situation. Libya is an example. Syria, we could talk about that too. But reliance on the military as the only actor brings military solutions that aren't always applicable to the situation at hand. So a lot of what Sciences Po students are studying when it comes to human rights, when it comes to humanitarian situations, those skills and those strengths are what you need in equal measure to the military, who are there just to provide security. And we have not had that balance work very well for us. The next one is that for the United States, we really need strategic patience. If we are going to become involved, whether in a situation like we were and still are with Afghanistan or Iraq, we have to understand that it's not going to be easy and it's not going to be over quickly. And we have to understand that we have to be dedicated to the people that are involved in the mission that we are undertaking. We have to understand that we can't just be motivated by our own goals and by our own timeline, but also by those people that we are now intervening in their country. And we've got to understand that that could be a very long process. And we can't just pick up and leave when our politics change. And I'll end with this. We have to be more critical in our oversight of these operations as a nation, whether it's the American people, understanding that this belongs to everyone in the country, not just a small minority to do these things, whether it's the US Congress that has got to have oversight of what the administrations are doing in a situation like this, and the news media as well. I think all of us, Afghanistan began to be to begin to fade as China came on the front burner, as other things came on the front burner. I think too much of Washington lost sight of what we were trying to do in Afghanistan. And so as we get into these kinds of situations in the future, we cannot forget about what we are doing and get distracted by other things. We've got to have, as a nation and as a government, we have to have more focus and maintain that focus if we're going to get involved in helping other and the problems that other nations are having.
Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you for emphasizing how important a master in human rights and humanitarian action can be. Okay, so let's give the floor to. We have 4 students lined up here. If you are able to make very, very short questions, we can take the 4 altogether. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll try my best. My name is Miriam. I'm also a second-year Human Rights and Humanitarian Action student, and I'm currently interning with the International Crisis Group. And my question is also to Mr. Townsend. And speaking to what your point was about staying engaged as the international community with Afghanistan and the problems that the issue of recognition and the sanctions issues poses to the humanitarian situation in the country. So in the past few weeks, we've seen the humanitarian catastrophe exacerbating, aid organizations shutting down, medical situations shutting down, because of an uncertainty of international engagement and what is legal and what isn't legal in engaging with Afghanistan. And you were talking about leverage of the US and of the international community on the Taliban, but looking at the engagement, looking at the appointments that were made last week, it doesn't seem like the Taliban have been pressured very much by the international community, and they've been serving their internal purposes rather than the external issues of recognition. So I'm just wondering, how do you see this engagement, and how can we make sure that the international community can intervene and help the humanitarian situation? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Hannah. I'm in the International Economic Policy Program, and I also have a question for Mr. Townsend about the nature of the U.S. withdrawal. So specifically, I'm wondering whether it would have endangered the security of U.S. troops to have a more coordinated withdrawal strategy with consultation from Afghan partners, and particularly with the Bagram Air Base withdrawal. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Faye. I'm an international relations PhD student here, but I'm also a former UK representative to NATO. My question is to Jim. It's to what extent do you think US handling of the Afghanistan withdrawal from the peace process to the eventual military withdrawal has damaged US credibility with allies and partners around the world, particularly if, as others have noted, there could be a resurgent threat posed by Al-Qaeda or ISIS-KP that eventually finds its way onto the streets of Europe? Thank you.
Hello, thank you. My name is Louise Messel. I'm an international security student, and my question was to Mr. Townsend, again, sorry, about the withdrawal of the US forces, and specifically about the equipment that they left in Afghanistan, and what could you say on that? Thank you.
Okay, Jim, you are very popular. So you have 4 questions, and this is your mission. Do you think you can answer them very, very shortly? Because we will have to wrap up soon, and we'll take those 2 questions very, very fast at the end, but no more questions after that. Thank you. Jim, over to you.
Yes, I'll be as fast as I can. And I'm always available. If anyone wants to follow up, I'm always available to have a further discussion if you'd like. Very happy to do that. First, in concerning the international community, the humanitarian engagement that we need to do, how do we intervene? It seems to me, and I think this is a lot of the discussion, is that the Afghanistan of today is not the Afghanistan of the 1990s. And that the Taliban, in order to govern, and I just hate even thinking of this, but even saying it makes me sick. But as the Taliban are now in a position of governance, they're going to need things from the international community, and I think that the problem becomes, how do you balance the humanitarian needs that are urgent of the Afghan people who need medicine and food and other things right now? Versus other things that the Afghan government might want, like international financing or help to keep the airport open, things that aren't as urgent and aren't as such a strong humanitarian need. I mean, you get the most leverage by cutting everything off from Afghanistan and really making the Taliban, in terms of governance, you really hurt their ability to do that. But by doing so, you're hurting the Afghan people. So how can you let in enough of the urgent humanitarian assistance to the Afghan people, on the one hand, without giving away your leverage on the Afghan people that are in Kabul trying to govern? And I think that's what we're going to try to have to handle, is that balance, because I think there's going to be in the international community a real attempt to leverage what we can in terms of World Bank financing or international humanitarian assistance, trying to hold that back until we see these changes, while trying to give the Afghan people what they need. So, and I think this is really something important for Sciences Po, for the professors and for the students. We need you all to be working on ideas on how best this could work, because we haven't found ourselves in a situation quite like this. So really, over to you also that question on how can we best use leverage? What does that look like? What can we do that can compel change by the Afghan governance while not hurting the people? Secondly, in terms of the nature of the withdrawal and coordination, I think I think there was more consultation and coordination earlier on with international partners when it came to what was being discussed in terms of the so-called treaty or peace or agreement that had been going on during the Trump administration. I think there had been more discussion there. There had been discussion with NATO on what that might look like, but certainly not the consultations and discussions I think one would expect at a time like this. But where the failure truly happened was as the Taliban began to sweep into Afghanistan, and as Kabul became increasingly threatened, and we needed to figure out how can we pull out those individuals who needed to leave. That's where the consultations truly fell down. I think things were moving too fast. I think the very brand new Biden team was probably learning as they went along on what needed to be done. And so I think that's where we saw a real need for better coordination, but there wasn't time because things moved so quickly. And I think that became the route that it absolutely became. And it was really in those last 30 days, more than any other time, where we fell down when it came to consultations. Concerning our credibility, absolutely. There is no doubt U.S. credibility was damaged by this. I would say since 9/11, U.S. credibility has taken quite a hit in a number of ways. Whether you look at Iraq, how we responded in a lot of ways to 9/11 and the global war on terrorism. I think the last 20 years has been a period of damaged credibility and other damages to our values in the United States and how we work with allies. We could talk for a long time on that. But what I would say is you're absolutely right. And for the United States, we're going to have many years where we're going to have to regain that trust. And we're dedicated to doing that. And one of those is learning lessons. And that's what we've got to be able to do. And part of it, too, is ensuring that we don't have a resurgence of terrorism in Europe. What happened in Paris, I remember so well, and it still is a raw wound for me. Those things that happened there, as well as in other places, Brussels and other places in Europe too. So for the United States to regain our credibility, we have to make sure we do our bit, not just as a nation, but working with other allies and partners globally to try to make sure that we don't have a resurgence of terrorism. At a minimum, that we don't have a resurgence of terrorism that see it playing out in European streets, but also our credibility to ensure that we can force the Taliban as best we can to respect the progress that has been made over the past 20 years. And that's part of our credibility as well. And finally, on the equipment left behind, I can assure you that most of that equipment left behind was not equipment that was I think there was a bit of an exaggeration by the news media, only because it was a confusing time, that there were aircraft and hangars, combat aircraft, there were tanks, this type of thing. I think the things that were left behind were not going to be so valuable to the Taliban. They might be driving around in a Humvee, but what I will tell you, and unfortunately this is what the Afghan National Security Forces found out too, is U.S. equipment requires a lot of maintenance. So my guess is 1 year from now, you're not going to see a lot of the U.S. equipment that was left behind in any usable condition at all.
Thank you so much, Jim. So I've been told that there is a course in this room after us. So I really, really apologize for both of you. And if you want to share your questions with me by email, I'll be happy to come back to you with the members of the panel. Thank you. So let me give the floor to our panel members here and start with Madam Minister, if you have a final word for us.
تینا و برگزار کننده های این پروگرام بسیار زیبا. بسیار خوش بودم که نظریات و افکار خود یک بخشش تانستم امرای دوستا شریک بسازم و فقط با استفاده از فرصت از دوستایی که ما را حمایت کردن و ما را پشتیبانی کردن که توانستیم روزهای اخیری را که در افغانستان بودیم بتونیم از افغانستان بیرون شویم. از دوست گرامیم خانم فهیم روبیول، از وکیل پارلمان فدریک دوما و ملت و مردم فرانسه واقعا سپاسگزار هستم که برای ما این فرصت داد که تانستیم همکاری بسیار صمیمانه کردن که از افغانستان در یک حالت بسیار مشکل و سخت بیرون شویم و فقط به اصطلاح روح زخم خورده خود را نجات دادیم. ولی افکار ما، یادهای وطن با ما هست، یادهای هر لحظه کشور ما و عزیزایی را که در افغانستان پشت سر گذاشتیم و ما نمیفهمیم که چی وقت و در کجا اونا را دوباره ملاقات خواهیم کرد. تشکر.
I would translate. Ms. Moman is thanking Tina Jan and thanking Mark for having this platform for us to talk about what has happened to Afghanistan and what we are going through. At the same time, she thanked the French people and the French government, specifically those who helped her and Afghans like us to evacuate from Kabul to Paris, especially Madame Robiol and one of our parliamentarians, Ms. Doma.
Frédéric Doma, she is the vice president of the Amity group in Assemblée Nationale.
Not our parliamentarians, your parliamentarian until I become a French. She says that it was a very warm welcome for us in France. We were only able to get out our shattered souls and broken hearts to France from Afghanistan. Thank you all. Thank you so much.
I would say that there are still the women leaders, the parliamentarians, the journalists, the judges who are still in Afghanistan and hiding. We know and we have the pictures that the Taliban are in there, are searching them, and they are the vulnerable people. So I would like that we don't forget these people and we try our best to communicate, make the advocacy in order to bring them out of the Kabul, and we make possible that they will be in a safe place. The last thing that I would say, it is your duty, it is our duty as the citizens of the world, because most of you are the international students, that we say that enough is enough. We cannot stay and look the situation like that, because Afghanistan cannot be covered by a wall, and this situation will be penetrated in the other countries, in the other regions, and will touch each of us. So we have to communicate, we have to make all our possibility as a citizen to say no in the coming weeks, in the coming months, not to recognize the Taliban as a government.
Thank you. So thank you so much, both of you. Thank you, Jim. It's now time to end this event and this significant discussion, and I know that this conversation is far from being over. I'm sure that in the coming months, we will have other events to pursue this conversation about Afghanistan. And I would like to express my sincere gratitude for the members of our panel for sharing this perspective on this complex situation. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to the audience who joined us also remotely, and for the important question you raised. So, as you all said very, very, very well, it's up to us not to repeat the same mistakes. And so let's hope that we're going to learn from these lessons. Thank you all so much. Take care.